recording.
Okay, so one of the things I noticed this year, are you guys both first year teachers, or?
I just finished my second year.
Oh, okay. So
yeah, second year as well for me.
Okay, so so you're finishing after this summer, or you're going into your second year?
Going into my third. I graduate in December.
Oh, okay. So you guys are ahead of me. So I'm in a little bit of a strange position because like when I took this job, I wasn't like actually looking for it. And so I kind of got hired out because they heard we'd moved back to this town. And then I didn't get my contract renewed. So I am actually going to a school 30 miles away because the people that took my job left that position. And so I have a little bit of a different perspective of like bullying and the school climate, because I was kind of not really bullied per se, but they had been like soliciting out these people from underneath me. And I was kind of always on the defense and asking about my position and stuff. And so it was kind of a strange thing for me to see, you know, like all the social emotional stuff that was going on and the administration was pumping out, and yet they weren't following it. Like they had no integrity or anything. And so my perspective as a first year teacher is really jaded now, you know? So I'm curious to know what it's like for you guys, since you guys finished your second year in teaching, like if you noticed a difference with, you know, pre-pandemic versus this last year, because I don't have anything to compare it to, but obviously my stance is particularly strange because I didn't get renewed, so now it's going to be weird. But I'm just curious what your guys' thoughts were and how like bullying or anything in the climate changed because of like either the pandemic, or you just noticed it differently because you came back after your first year.
So for me, I think among staff at our school, at my school in particular, our principal is incredible, but there are a lot of older staff and then new teachers. And these new teachers, myself included, are coming in with a lot of new ideas, and surrounding the bullying, they just tend to be like, well, I've been teaching for 30 years and I know what I'm doing. So they just seem to kind of undermine the younger teachers in a way. I don't know.
Yeah, that's actually how it started. Is we had a new principal and a new assistant principal, and the assistant principal always undermined everybody, and even the students really had a hard time with dealing with her, and I just couldn't put up with it because she basically was threatening me, and I know she was threatening students, and I was kind of at first standing up for the students. So for me, because I'm Asian, like I felt targeted as a result of that, and it's a very white school, so it was kind of tough for me. Like I felt like I was the recipient of everything. And so I'm just curious, like if you guys notice anything like with races, if that changes anything, because it sounds like there's obviously a big rift in your school, just like in old teachers versus new teachers, not necessarily age, but just, I mean, like how I view things and coming in, obviously I brought a bunch of different ideas and they weren't well received because they can't handle that much change that quickly.
I think that in my district, so our district has a mission statement which says that at our core, we care about inclusivity. We want to make sure that everybody feels welcome and everybody is invited into the classroom. And I hesitate to think that there would be any district in the country in which that would not be the mission statement. I think that from a marketable standpoint, saying that you are inclusive is something good, but whether or not the district itself is inclusive is part of the issue. Because a district might say, oh, our mission statement is that everybody should feel welcome within the classroom. But then the reality is that within the classroom, you might have elements of bullying, there might be racist comments that are made, and as a teacher, we respond to that bullying, or we respond to that racism. And perhaps in doing so, the district might not view the things that we view as exclusive or non-inclusive behaviors as actually being non-inclusive. And it's hard, because, for instance, I'm from California, and so like the attitudes towards what is considered acceptable within the classroom in California are very different from here in Kansas. The aspect of what is considered free speech, free and protected speech, versus what is considered openly hostile speech is different between the two states. And for me, there are times when I experience a bit of culture shock at like what is permissible by the district, given that my personal view of the district's mission statement is not exactly what the district means to convey by their own statement. And I feel like that reflects itself with like elder or veteran teachers, with like certain administrators, and it's tough.
Yeah. Well, I don't know the breakdown of your guys' particular schools and districts, but my school is about 90% Hispanic, and like then like 3% Vietnamese, and then like 4% Caucasian. So all of our students are fluent in Spanish, and we have one teacher in the building who can speak Spanish. And all of the teachers are Caucasian. And so it's just like this weird cultural difference between the staff and the teachers and our students. And like, I came in knowing this and knowing I was going to need to completely embrace this culture in order to be accepted by my students. And so like, my middle schoolers were giving me vocab tests every week of like the random words they would teach me, and like just like ways that I could incorporate their culture, something which is completely different than the way I was raised in my small Kansas town. So like incorporate their culture into my life and figure out how it, I don't know if that's kind of a way that in our school we're trying to like break down those like cultural barriers, because I don't know if that makes sense. But.
Wow, that's really crazy that you have that large of a Hispanic population.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty crazy.
Downtown Wichita.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm in Medicine Lodge, which is like an hour and a half southwest, and it was really interesting. Like when I read one of those articles from the reading about like anti-racism and educators and like being passive versus actively anti-racist versus non-racist and stuff, and it was really interesting because like I think there's me and one girl that was in the high school that she's Filipino, and that was the only Asians, and then several mixed Black descent of some sort. I don't know all of them per se, but the articles were really only focusing on like Black Lives Matter, and I'm like, we're in a pandemic with a Asian virus and like the Asian hate crimes and everything, and so they never would address that or ever talk about it. But I could definitely feel like sometimes the way they did stuff, I was always like, I feel like I'm kind of pushed on the outset. So I'm also actually from California. Chris, where did you grow up?
I'm from Southern California,
Okay.
Basically the LA area.
Yeah, I grew up near San Francisco, so yeah, I spent the first 20 some odd years of my life there, and so it's very different, I think, being here. And I think everyone here is so sheltered from what they really think it's like in other places. And so I think for me, I view it as not so much that they don't embrace people, but they don't go out of their way to and do that, as opposed to in California, where I don't think people really thought about it all that much. So I think that one of the things that I really noticed more than anything was like when was it our case studies that we had to do for this class? Was that this class or our other class? I did it on like disclosing or mandated disclosures if there's like neglect and abuse. And I was really surprised to see, you know, the different economical disadvantages with kids here, and how, like, my perception always was like race has contributed to that. And I think here, I mean, we're so white prolific here that I was kind of shocked by just how much, you know, it doesn't matter what your race is, you're still going to be potentially influenced by that economic disadvantage here. So I was kind of surprised to see that over this last year, you know, when we did our assignment from the very first summer with whatever we had to look at, like the economically disadvantaged students, but then seeing it in person and in class was kind of interesting, and you could really pick that out. But I never really saw kids treat them differently per se. I did see it with the staff and the administration to some extent, and I guess I was never really anticipating that as much as I would have thought. You know, I would have thought it would have come from students themselves as opposed to like the faculty.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think kids are much better about being anti-racist than adults, and adults aren't good at checking their biases or anything, whereas kids just like, they're like, that's just another kid. They just have no idea, you know, which they don't need to. So that's a good point, that the students, like, they don't have any of those biases that adults may have.
I feel like in some ways, though, that has a lot to do with like even the gender, you know, like I was a stay-at-home mom for the last 10 years, so I was really kind of separated from a lot of this stuff. And so, you know, like I made a comment once about something about girls or whatever, and like girls usually do this or something, like I don't even remember what it was. And this one girl was like, well, you know, you don't have to be a girl to do that. And I was like, oh, please, let's not get started on this whole gender, who can do what, and whether you're a guy or a girl. And I was like, I'm not equipped to handle this. I know this is like the new thing, but I was like, this is foreign territory to me. And I'm like, I'm just going to let you take that however you want. Cause I was like, that's going to be like the new form of racism, I think. And I mean, it's not race, but I could tell that they were like wanting to almost egg me on to this. And I was like, I don't know enough about it. I'm not equipped for this.
I think this conversation is particularly interesting because it is very relevant to what is happening currently, in the sense that one of the big, issues is critical race theory and how it's being presented within schools. And there are a number of states, Kansas, for instance, has asked all of its universities to provide lists of classes that teach critical race theory. And many different universities across Kansas, the University of Kansas being one, have said that there are not many classes that openly, or I should say, focus entirely on critical race theory. But to me, with this month in particular, and the fact that Juneteenth, I believe, is actually today, yeah, and the fact that, like, I think in the state of Texas, it's not acceptable to talk about Juneteenth. I can't remember if I had read an article about this recently, but the fact of the matter is that it seems conceptually dishonest to teach history without teaching the reality of history. I'm not a history teacher. I am a Latin teacher. But I fully recognize that my subject matter has traditionally been used to marginalize groups. I recognize that my major, my very being, I'm a white male, that my profession caters to white people, and that traditionally those that have studied classics are white, predominantly white. And this is something that my field has tried to address recently, to a certain extent. Princeton University, for instance, has changed its requirements for the classics major in order to make the major more equitable for students of all different backgrounds. But it's a particularly challenging issue because there is so much involved in education. Like, education itself is particularly a political issue. For my case study, I chose walling off and the issue of discrimination, or how to create an inclusive classroom. And part of what was mentioned in that case study is that it is almost impossible to simultaneously create an inclusive classroom and also welcome everybody's opinions, because there are some opinions that are designed in such a way so as to discriminate or keep other people from participating or feeling welcome in discussion. In my district, for instance, there was a teacher, I believe this year, that was actually put on leave because she had hung a Black Lives Matter poster. For me personally, I don't see how, again, returning to my district's mission statement about creating inclusivity, making sure that everybody feels welcome, it would seem that telling a certain group that has traditionally been marginalized that they are indeed welcome within the classroom can be considered hateful speech to others. I don't know. To me, that seems a little absurd. And this is such a complex issue, but unfortunately, as educators, we're not just educators. We're also people responsible for challenging these issues that have existed and letting students know that the way things were in the past, the attitudes towards certain races, even those attitudes that are shared currently, like towards Asian Americans, for instance, and the hate that has been targeted towards Asian Americans is wrong and should not be acceptable. But yeah.
Well, I think you started with a really good point of like checking your own bias, right? Chris, like you talked about how you as white male, like, or studying the classics, like all of that is like checking your own bias. Also, once we get into like the gender and the like sexuality of our students, like I teach at a Catholic school. So like, obviously, like I am Catholic, like those are my beliefs. Like, I struggle with them sometimes, but like I have to like support those to my students and like tell them that like, well, God loves everyone. And, but like, while trying to create this inclusive classroom, I also have to like support those beliefs because that is our school and that is my district. And so, yeah, you have to like walk this fine line of like trying to like include everyone and make everyone feel loved, because I feel like that's kind of our mission, as cheesy as it is, as educators, like make everyone sure that they feel loved and cared for at the end of the day, because we are there and we will show up for them. But at the same time, yeah, like supporting my district's policies as well. And, yeah.
So, like with being at a Catholic school or like teaching Latin, do you feel like, guys, with the Latin class specifically, like do you feel like the kids that take that class are going to be more likely to be like the rich white kids who, you know, are college bound and they have, you know, like the designated path that they're on? Like, because if you look at that theory, like I just wonder, you know, how does that conflict with the idea of the staff, for instance, predetermining like, hey, you're going to college, so you have to take this class, and you're, you're definitely not going to college, so we're definitely not going to put you in that class. Like, I kind of talked about this, I don't remember, in one of my discussions about like how that is with even paras, because I teach high school science, so I got physics, chemistry, earth science, and you know, this integrated science class I teach had a para, and what I had the issue with was that the para would a lot of times just give the kids the answer. And, you know, I mean, I want to be inclusive, but I feel like I'd almost be better off if I had that as a separate class and then could cater it to them, as opposed to, you know, hey, I'm trying to get you to be at the same level as everyone else when you're clearly not. And in some ways, I feel like not only am I holding the others back, but I'm also preventing the other, you know, sped kids from actually getting beyond where the para kind of limits them, because they, you know, like what I noticed in our school at least was that, you know, those kids, you know, the middle realm kids would refer to them as retards, and I was always just like, oh my God, is that word still even in the system, you know? And but more importantly, like the sped kids, you know, they were so used to like being spoon fed stuff and just not really their own race, but they were put at this level where we weren't actually teaching them. So we were kind of making them more of a minority, I feel like, because they weren't actually learning anything. And so I wonder, like with Latin, you know, it's like we've already put them in this tier of, hey, you're up here regardless, so we treat you differently because of the classes that you're in, you know. So I have to wonder, like, in some, it's like biased towards the more intellectual, I guess, in that sense.
Well, I do want to say that, like, my school is a Catholic school and it's private, but we're Title I school. I think it's like 75% of our students are on free and reduced lunch. Like, a lot of our students will not be college bound, and like it's private Catholic school. So like we do have to cater towards students not going to college, but I mean, and students going to college. So just because it's private school does not necessarily mean that we are catering towards, you know, the wealthier.
Which school are you at?
It's called St. Patrick.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Where do you teach at, Chris? Where do you teach at, Chris?
Sorry, I teach at Shawnee Mission South High School in Overland Park.
I guess we should introduce ourselves at the beginning.
Well, so I have a confession to make, because this is something that with a Californian, I try to dance around. Originally, I'm from Orange County, which comes with its fair share of stereotypes. So if you are unfamiliar, those that come from Orange County tend to be very affluent. This is something that like was inevitably, I was born lucky, I guess. There has never been an obstacle that I have encountered during my education, that at no point was I ever denied an opportunity that might have otherwise been available to somebody else. This is something that I didn't realize until, sadly, far too late into my education. I had never felt the way I currently do about these sorts of issues. And it wasn't until people had begun to challenge me on my attitudes, and rightfully so, that I began to reflect on this issue of privilege and the fact that I was privileged. I was studying a traditionally privileged major. I mentioned Princeton had changed its requirements. Now you don't need to learn Greek or Latin for its major, for the classics major. And the article that was written about it literally had the title "Dumbing Down the Classics," which I had extreme exception with, because the idea was that in catering to non-traditional classics groups, and let's be honest, we mean students of color, that we are inherently dumbing down our profession, that it doesn't have the same zenith of education, that, you know, this is the pinnacle of one's learning as we traditionally look at it. And that's just, it's bogus. That is something that I'm trying to teach my students. You don't You don't need to be white. You don't need to be wealthy to take an interest in the classics. But I recognize why, if you were not white, a student of color, that you would find exception with the Romans. Take, for instance, the book that I use. This is the best book for learning Latin, I think. But the problem is that it approaches issues that can be very challenging for students that are very charged. The issue of slavery is introduced in chapter 2 because the Romans themselves, within their family, the family in the Roman mind was not just your parents and those that you were related to, but it literally included everybody that lived in your household. When we think of the Romans, we think of wealthy Romans that were wealthy enough to own a villa, a mansion. They had slaves. And the issue of slavery is something that we often don't talk about with the Romans, or with these challenging issues like their attitudes towards women. They were horrible. And it's important to not push those things aside. We do have to confront the challenging issues of the Romans if we want to consider them to be the, greatest empire in the world, because they gave us a lot of the attitudes that we currently have. Like the Americans, our whole system of slavery was based off of the Roman system of slavery. Our attitudes towards women and what is acceptable for one gender and another gender comes from the Romans. And so as a teacher, I recognize that these are political issues, but inherently this is a part of what I teach. And so I almost unapologetically teach these things because it's important for students to know about. But again, I recognize that I am privileged to be in the position that I'm at.
It's interesting that you say that, because I remember when I applied to colleges, one was UC San Diego, and this was back probably before you guys were born, maybe. The year I applied, they had just so many applicants, mostly females and Asians, and I didn't get in. And so it was weird, because I always grew up kind of thinking I had this reversed viewpoint of where I really stood. And so it makes me wonder, like, when you're talking about like teaching these in the classes, like, do you think that what you see in terms of any sort of like racism or privilege within the school is because of how each of those individual staff members themselves were brought up or raised, or what they saw? Like for me, I feel like, I felt in some ways like an underdog for a long time growing up. So maybe I always like helped or picked on the underdog in my classes potentially. Like, do you think that like your background or other backgrounds from other staff members really contributed or shaped how they really upheld like the mission statement, for instance, or racism or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I this is also addressed in the case study that I had read. But I think that students inherently, when they walk into our classroom is an environment that we create. We set the expectations, ensure these expectations are within the line of our school, but to a certain extent, every class is going to be different because every educator is different and the expectations that we set are different. But I think in both of our cases, or I think in everybody's case, we have to recognize that like we are not the primary educators. Whenever the students are done with school, in the case of me, 2:40, they go home, and the things that they hear at home might be very different than what they hear in my classroom. The things that I consider acceptable might not be considered acceptable to the parents of my students. And I think as a student, especially when you are like pre-college, you can be very impressionable to what your parents tell you. And I think these inherent biases you form as a direct result of hearing what your parents tell you. So that in the case of the case study, there were first graders who were talking about how Mexicans are bad and they're drug dealers. And a first grader does not form that opinion. on their own. You don't read that in literature. You certainly don't turn on a cartoon and see that. That is very much a learned behavior as a direct result of what's going on at home. And unfortunately, we only have like 50 minutes a day to address that. And even then, we have an even smaller amount of time to address that when we see it, because we can't just address these attitudes every class. We have like our own content that we have to teach. So it's such a complicated issue.
I think the most important thing that we as educators can do, like moving forward, because like these past 2 years have just been absolutely crazy, and racism obviously for this last year has been, well, it's always been a major issue, but an even bigger like major issue is just like be that positive role model for our students, and to like show our students that including everyone is cool and like the right thing to do, and show that by like my favorite thing to do is greet every student by name in the morning. So like if they're coming into my classroom, I'm going to greet them by their name and like try to have a conversation with them about something other than math. I teach math. And so I just want to talk about anything other than math for the first 10 minutes of class, or not 10 minutes, that's a long time. But, you know, like we just need to like be that positive role model and show them that it's not a difficult thing to do to be kind and to just only say nice words. And so, yeah, just moving forward, we can, yeah, sometimes our conversations need to be explicit about racism and explicit about what we say and how we act and include people, but sometimes it can just be the way we act ourselves. And like, we don't need to talk about it every day if we're showing them through our actions.
Do you feel like, since you taught the second year, do you feel like, hey, get out of this way. Do you feel that like the pandemic changed how people viewed stuff? Like even like masks versus not wearing masks, like did they treat people differently, you think, than your first year? Or was everyone just kind of blindly trying to get through the year?
I think my students, I don't know if Chris, you experienced the same thing. They really missed each other. And like my school, it's really small, and so it's the same students kindergarten through 8th grade year, and they are a tight-knit close group. And I teach middle school, so by the time they get to middle school, they are all best friends. And watching my students interact like my first year versus coming back in September last year, we were in person all year, they just like wanted to like hang out more than ever. So they were like treating each other better this year, I think, because they realized how much like they missed that social interaction. It was really hard to be like, wait, stay apart. I know you love each other, stay apart. I know you love each other, keep your mask on. Miss, we see each other every day after school. Sorry, put your mask back on. So yeah, I think they treated each other better this year because of how much they missed each other last year.
Yeah, my students would say the same thing too. You know, it's like, oh, Mr. Wilkins, like, we see each other all the time. We hung out yesterday. And I was like, I don't care. You're in my class. Like, those masks remain on. Don't you dare. But it's interesting because this year, I feel like with my classes, one of the things that comes most natural for me as a teacher is building classroom community. I feel like if I were to assess myself, that would be the area in which I just feel comes naturally. This year, however, I've noticed that for all of my Latin 1 classes, there was like no sense of camaraderie at all, with one exception. And part of the problem was that when we started out the year, our district had a no camera on policy. that it was okay for students to not have their cameras on. And I recognize why that existed, and I respect that. However, I also recognize that given the opportunity to, students would not want their cameras on. And that by not having their cameras on, they would not be able to see each other. They wouldn't even recognize that there were human beings that were in the class and that they were participating in the discussion, because most students preferred to just privately message me their answers or privately message me their questions. So that if you were to look at like the class discussion, there was like nothing there in the everyone chat. Then when we transitioned to hybrid, students were starting to see each other for the first time, but like these were complete strangers. Even though we talked all the time, or I had engaged with all of them, they never engaged each other, and they never even saw each other's faces until just then. And it was difficult because with those particular classes, to give an example, we had a class discussion about the January 6th, or what had happened on January 6th, because it came in the next day and I was just like, you know what, this is a teachable moment. We talked about something from the Roman world, but I gave them an opportunity to just discuss. And it just so happened that the class that had the least amount of camaraderie, or the least amount of like recognizing each other as individuals, had the most heated discussion, that they were most likely to say things that they would not have said had we been full in person the entire year. And that required my intervention on multiple occasions. And one class in particular, I just had to cut the entire discussion off and say, I'm sorry, you guys, but this is not civil at all. And that's part of the problem. That's why what happened yesterday happened. And yeah, I think COVID has certainly affected attitudes and behaviors, because for students that do know each other, that had gone through Latin 1 last year, they were so excited to see each other. They just wanted to play and have fun. They wanted to do the brain breaks that we did normally. Like, it was totally a natural transition and there were no issues whatsoever. But for every other class, it was like, I have no idea who these people are. And there was apprehension to becoming friends with them until later in the year. So
yeah, it'll be interesting to see then, like, maybe long-term effects of like COVID and how that affects like how kids interact, you know, whether that's a racial or just lack of social interaction or anything along those lines. I mean, like having a more aggressive discussion, you know, for kids that don't know each other. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, further down the road, what kind of repercussions we see from that. With, I'd like to say that hopefully it will clear up racism a little bit, but I suspect if anything, it might further divide people because we're so shut off now. Or so we're so, like, I feel like everyone's so used to being kind of shut off that like they appreciate the ones they love, but they dislike the people that they don't know even more. So yeah. Anyone else have anything they want to add? I mean, we've definitely talked long enough, so we probably can stop the recording, I guess.
Okay.